Hello everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this very special session. My name is Tori, and I have the privilege of serving as the moderator for today. This seminar is provided by the United Proud Women, a nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering sexual minority women through knowledge, community, and advocacy. And we're truly thrilled to host this event. It is an extraordinary honor for me to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Judith Butler, who will deliver a lecture on the global impact of queer theory. Influential thinkers of our time, and their work scarcely requires an introduction. Nevertheless, to provide the context for our diverse audience, I would like to briefly highlight a few key works and areas of engagement. Their groundbreaking scholarship has fundamentally transformed the landscapes of gender studies, philosophy, cultural studies, political theory, literary studies, and psychoanalysis, among others. Many of you are undoubtedly familiar with seminal texts in queer theory, such as Gender Trouble, Feminism, and the Subversion of Identity, as well as Bodies That Matter on the Discursive Limits of Sex. And in our previous gender studies seminars, we have discussed two additional pieces of texts, Imitation and Gender Subordination, as well as Undoing Gender. These works have profoundly reshaped our understanding of gender, sexuality, and power, and continue to fuel critical debates more than 3 decades after their publication. And beyond these foundational texts, Professor Butler's scholarship has continually pushed the boundaries of critical thought, and the contributions are hard to overstate. Most recently, their 2024 book, Who's Afraid of Gender, takes on contemporary struggles over gender and the rise of global right-wing movements, an intervention that couldn't be more timely. In addition to their scholarly impact, Professor Butler has long been a prominent public intellectual and activist. Their advocacy spans global LGBTQ and feminist movements, and they have been an outspoken critic of wars against Palestine. They are also actively involved in human rights organizations, including the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York and the Advisory Board of Jewish Voice for Peace. And on a personal note, introducing Professor Butler today is deeply meaningful to me. Their work profoundly shaped my intellectual journey and sparked my passion for gender and sexuality studies during the very first year of my undergrad. And I know I'm not alone in this. Many young scholars in our community would credit Professor Butler's work with inspiring their ongoing exploration of gender and sexuality across various disciplines. So as we look forward to the insights Professor Butler will share, let's embrace this invaluable opportunity to learn from a truly distinguished scholar. So now please join me in offering a warm and heartfelt welcome to Professor Judith Butler. And Professor Butler, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here. I hope you can hear me well. Okay, excellent. Let me say first, I'm very grateful for this invitation. I was asked to speak about queer theory, as you know, and I think you will hear queer theory in action in what follows. Queer is, as you know, sometimes used as a term of identity. I say, I am queer, or I ask if you are queer, and by that expression, I indicate that I'm interested in knowing something about you. But when queer was first claimed as a term for an affirmative theory, for a movement, it was not at all conceived as a term of identity. It was even, I would say, anti-identity. It was a form of critique, a way of understanding anew the basic vocabularies by which the gendered and sexual world is organized. Moreover, it was a way of working with insult and degradation. If you were called queer in English prior to the 1990s, especially in the United States, you were not only being insulted, but you were receiving a verbal threat of possible violence against you. Queer then designated a practice of turning a hurtful and damaging term into something that could gather people together in an affirmative way that could produce a kind of solidarity. So queer, not so much identity, but yes, solidarity. It also named, or still names, a practice of critique, transforming something damaging into something affirmative. And this queer critical practice was not just dedicated to taking apart the heteronormative structures of society, but it also embodied the power of transformation and a potential for new solidarities. It mattered that queer theory came into being during the time that the AIDS crisis was most acute in the United States. We saw that our lives were not considered to be worthy, that resources were not being dedicated to research, and that the process, medical research, and that the process of our dying and even our deaths were not marked and not mourned. Many felt that their lives were treated as dispensable, not only by the government and its health services, but by the culture at large, including the media. We sought to assert our collective existence and the worth or dignity of our lives, our desires, our genders, the forms of intimate association we had chosen, and to demand health care and our own rights to live. At the same time, we did not want to fit into the list of LGBTQIA, etc., because we did not want to be treated as an identity. But why? What remains this resistance to identity? Well, on the one hand, we accepted that sexuality and identification were complex, and that sometimes a life story cannot be adequately represented by an identity category. For some people, sexual orientation changes over time. For others, gender changes. We want to think about gendered and sexual lives in time and in space, sometimes staying very stable, but sometimes undergoing important shifts. This was and remains a key point linking queer theory to feminism. We think we know what a woman is, what it means to be a woman. The society around us tells us what a woman is, or more often, what a woman should be. But then we find that those definitions can be too narrow, too restrictive, and we seek greater freedoms. We do that not just as individuals, but as people who are affected by cultural and social change, and who, as a result of those changes, become capable of making change, entering into social relations in order to make them more free, more equal, and more just. If we want to undertake a certain kind of work, or appear in a certain way, or love someone our family disapproves of, well, we may find that we risk no longer belonging to the category of gender that was originally assigned to us. Some of us then sees that category as an historical reality, as an historically changing construct, which means we are formed by it, but we also have the power to form it anew, to change the category into a more livable one we can affirm, and that affirms us. But for others, the category has to be left behind, and new categories of gender must be created to make life more livable, to find a language and social world that we can affirm and that affirms us as well. To be any identity at all involves an identification with a social category. That category has been produced by others. It comes to us with saturated historical meanings. And yet, our identification can intervene in that history, even opening up a different future. Identification and identity are not the same. Stuart Hall has said this. So has Jacqueline Rose. we do not close the gap between ourselves and the social category that defines us through identifying with the category. To identify with a category means there's a difference between oneself and the category. Identification names that gap, but so too does queer theory. We can identify with a category and say, yes, this is me, this category. Or we can disidentify with the categories imposed upon us. And that disidentification involves a negative or critical energy that is crucial for any effort to make the world anew. Jose Esteban Munoz knew this and wrote about disidentification as a queer theoretical construct. Similarly, we say, for instance, that we become our genders. And this proposition, drawn from the work of Simone de Beauvoir, is considered a defining characteristic of queer theory. And yet there is no straight path that defines that becoming. To become a gender is to undergo a series of deviations, to be part of a process that is open-ended and without teleology. Well, how central is this category of gender to queer theory? Well, it is as central to queer theory as sexuality. After the 1980s and throughout the 1990s, at least in the Anglosphere, we saw different permutations of queer theory, queer of color theory, examining how race and sexuality intersect with gender, queer Marxism, asking how gender and sexuality are reproduced by structures in society and the economy, queer crip theory, asking how the form and capabilities of the body enter into established ideas about gender, queer Asian studies, querying forms of gender and power in China, Japan, Korea, but also South Asia, drawing on a wide range of cultural traditions from religion and even martial arts, which is, after all, a place where gender is constantly negotiated. It is important to remind ourselves of several histories as we consider the way that gender and queer both have been accepted as terms of identity rather than ways of thinking about the structures of power and the potential for solidarity. In Anglophone feminism, gender has been a key framework beginning in the 1970s, established even more firmly in the 1980s as a necessary part of almost all feminist scholarship and policy work. Gender was not for feminism originally a term of identity. It was a framework for thinking about the unequal distribution of advantages in society, the division of labor that assigns women certain tasks, the reproduction of power dynamics that secure masculine power and dominance. Gender was thus a framework for analyzing a key form of power in society, one of the most fundamental forms. And then, of course, there were, and remain, many approaches: materialist, psychoanalytic, ecological, intersectional, Black feminist, as you know. And I underscore this point for at least two reasons. First, feminism and queer theory have more in common than is generally accepted these days. Gender is but one term that joins them, but also what joins them is the aspiration to live in a world without the fear of sexual violence and discrimination, to transform the world so that there is greater freedom and equality, and to find ways of living that are free of forcible constraint, pathologization, or criminalization. There are many emancipatory desires that link feminism, queer theory, and activism, and trans theory and activism. We use separate terms to describe these forms of study and modes of social engagement, but many of them are actually lived at the same time and together in ways that profoundly shape and intersect with each other. Indeed, as you probably know, the anti-gender ideology movement is one that is linked to rising authoritarianism, to a backlash against feminism, struggles for racial equality, and gender freedom. The same state powers that deny women reproductive freedoms are denying trans people of adequate and gender-affirming health care. The same powers are denying freedom to women, to people of color, to trans and queer people. It is as if the devastation of our political freedoms is now the condition for authoritarian emergence. The books taken off the shelves at libraries and censored in course curricula are feminist, queer, and trans. In other words, the state powers that would restrict freedoms, oppose equality, and deny our various existences are grouping us together in ways that we do not always group ourselves. In the United States, as you probably know, there is a new sense of dread about the future after the election of Donald Trump. Some fear the end of democracy, and others fear the end of the world. It is a dispiriting moment when climate catastrophe makes itself known through enormously destructive fires and floods, when the plans for deportation of migrants have already begun to be implemented, and rights of citizenship for those who have been born in this country with undocumented parents are also threatened. Over and against this very pessimistic vision are several social and political movements that will continue to strengthen during this time. Feminism is one of them, but so too is a complex alliance of movements dedicated to equal rights, gender freedom, racial equality and justice, the opposition to capitalism, carceral power, and climate destruction. Such movements are not political parties, nor are they fully represented by any existing political party. They put pressure on the party system. They include solidarities that struggle against racism, capitalism, and extractivism, campaigns against misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia, struggles for affordable education and the forgiveness of debt, and global struggles against imperial wars, including the genocide in Gaza and the mass death in Sudan. And they point out the failure of government to provide basic health services, shelters, and education for the people, a failure that is part of the destructive operation of capitalism and heteronormative patriarchy as they work together. Like many others, I was appalled and stilled by the executive order issued on January 20th of this year, entitled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. That's the title of the executive order. Well, how can women need defense from gender, given that women, as a plural category, is a gendered category, if not the most important one, in the history of gender studies and policy? When I published last year, Who's Afraid of Gender, I noted there that the campaign against gender ideology was very late to arrive in the United States. In the last few years, before, I would say 3 months ago, it had a life in conservative evangelical churches, in the CPAC conferences, which is the Conservative Political Action Committee, where seminars were regularly dedicated to combating gender ideology. The term itself was coined by the Vatican back in the 1990s taken up in Latin America by both Catholic and evangelical churches, mending a rift between them, publicized as an urgent topic at the World Congress of Families, especially in 2017 when Trump sent his representatives. It also appeared as an incendiary topic in presidential campaigns in Costa Rica, Uganda, South Korea, Taiwan, France, Italy, Argentina, and Brazil, to name a few. But the United States press hardly noticed. Viktor Orban in Hungary effectively allied with the Russian Orthodox Church in condemning gender ideology, and in turn, Putin declared his fidelity to J.K. Rowling's critique of trans rights in 2022, when he, Putin, sought to establish that gender freedoms associated with the West were a threat to Russia's spiritual essence and national security. It seems that Ukraine's effort to join the EU was a problem in part because the EU does seek to defend gender freedoms and opposes gender-based violence and is in favor of anti-discrimination law, especially protective of women and other sexual and gendered minorities. The anti-gender ideology was developed over the tenure of the last two popes. However, with Francis, despite his occasional progressivism, there was an acceleration of the discourse, an insistence that gender was a threat to man, to woman, to their differences, to civilization, family, and the natural order of human relations, to nature itself. And those Vatican discourses cast gender as a demonic power, analogous to the Ebola virus or even Hitler Youth. Well, Trump comes late to this terrible party, although in 2018 he instructed his Department of Health and Human Services to declare sex as an immutable feature of human personhood, leaning into the Vatican's invocation of natural law. At that time, his administration claimed that genitalia and plain language were the two criteria to be used in determining sex. The immediate political goal of this lexical move was to block trans people from gaining protections against sex discrimination under what is called Title IX, the legal instrument in the United States that prohibits sex discrimination in any federally funded activity. At that time, the Supreme Court had only begun to consider the case Bostock v. Clayton, which was decided in 2021, and which posed the question of whether discriminatory treatment against trans people can be considered legally as a form of sex discrimination. Ultimately, the justices, some of whom were appointed by Trump, decided that Title IX could be used to protect trans people against discrimination on two grounds. Firstly, the sex assigned to a person at birth can be different from the sex the person assumes in time. This was taken by the Supreme Court to be just a matter of fact. And secondly, for anyone to be treated unequally on the basis of a perception of their sex is an established form of sex discrimination. So trans people, if they are discriminated against on the basis of the sex acquired or assumed in time, are suffering sex discrimination. And if they are treated unequally on the basis of how they are perceived, how their sex is perceived, that is also a perfectly legitimate basis for a sex discrimination complaint. So the problem in discrimination, as it's outlined in this legal context, is not the sex you are or the sex were assigned. It has very little to do with what is biologically the case. It has everything to do with how your sex is perceived and how you are then treated on the basis of that perception and whether that treatment results in discrimination. It's simply wrong if one is treated unfairly on the basis of a prejudiced understanding of what one's sex is. The argument of this Supreme Court case, which I consider in the book, Who's Afraid of Gender, the argument of this case, written by Neil Gorsuch, a Trump appointee, seemed to have defeated Trump's effort at the time to make the initial sex assignment given to any person permanent and unchangeable. It's no wonder that in the executive order issued in January of this year, the presidential offices explicitly include among its dictates the need to correct any misapplications of Bostock v. Clayton. Here, Trump has to stand up to a court and its decision, which is generally considered to be sympathetic to his aims, but in this case contradicts his executive order. It's interesting that in the most recent executive order, Trump's legal team shifts from identifying the immutable, unchangeable features of sex from genitalia, 2018, to gametes, 2025. Why this shift? And by the way, what does it mean that one can change one's mind about what exactly is immutable about sex? The existence of intersexed people has posed a problem for sex assignment from the beginning, given that genitalia can be combined or mixed in some ways. Gametes appear to be less problematic, but why? There's a larger gamete and a smaller one, and that is said to be the immutable difference between female and male. But note, the smaller one emerges from the larger one. So the larger one is primary. In the beginning, the sex, the only sex, is female. That was not the conclusion they hoped to see. But there are two other problems with this standard. The first is that no one consults gametes at the moment of sex assignment, or for that matter, at conception. They are not observable. Thus, to base sex assignment on gametes is to rely upon an imperceptible, non-observable dimension of sex at the very moment when observation still remains the main instrument for sex assignment. With genitalia, when genitalia was the criteria, it was supposed to be easy to observe and to name, but that always depended on the lens through which one sees and the ability not to see complexity when it appears. Moreover, as the Society for the Study of Evolution maintains in a letter they published on February 5th of this year, the statements claimed to be scientific by the government are in fact contradicted by extensive scientific evidence. The scientific consensus, they write, defines sex in humans as a biological construct that relies on a combination of chromosomes, hormonal balances, and the resulting expression of gonads, external genitalia, and secondary sex characteristics. There is variation in all these biological attributes that make up sex. So the term sex names a complexity. They remind us, this Society for the Study of Evolution, that sex and gender result from the interplay of genetics and environment. Such diversity is a hallmark of biological species, including humans. Okay, end quote. interplay, interaction, co-construction. All these are scientific paradigms we find in the biological sciences that are applied to the question of sex determination. The language of immutability belongs more properly to a natural law tradition, one that claims that male and female are established by divine will and so belong to a version of creationism. So I would suggest to you that Trump is smuggling creationism into his scientific definition of sex. Indeed, sex differences are immutable features of the person, as both Pope Paul and Pope Francis have affirmed. For Trump to speak in the name of science, quite apart from this cameo appearance of the gamete theory, is simply to insist that God decreed the immutable character of two sexes and only two, and Trump is decreeing said fact again after echoing the word of God or letting his word become God's word and acting as if it is science speaking. So most biologists agree that neither biological determinism nor biological reductionism can provide adequate accounts of sex determination and development, and that's important. But it does not follow that gender theorists deny biology or biological reality just because they reject biological determinism and biological reductionism. Indeed, both determinism and reductionism are bad science. Complexity characterizes the biological sciences in their most current state, and complexity is exactly, by the way, what queer theory affirms. The presidential edict asserts the power to define what sex will be, which means that it treats gender ideology, or sometimes its extremist version, as something that must be destroyed and replaced in public discourse, and all federally funded activity, which includes sports and higher education, research, and healthcare. The state claims that gender ideology is something that exists. But what if gender ideology does not exist? What if it is an insult, a slur, a phantasm, something conjured, abbreviating and demonizing a complex, often fractious, productive, and indispensable form of scholarship, social policy, social movement, law? As it stands right now, any reference to gender in government-financed activities, including university grants, health policies, civil rights protections, qualifies it for defunding. But if there is no such thing as gender ideology, if this very notion is a politically invested phantasm opposing a slew of social policies, um, um, that deprive women, children, trans, queer, non-binary, and intersex people of their rights and freedoms, then gender ideology can be said to be construed or even constructed. Paradoxically, it was the claim that gender is socially constructed that enraged its opponents, especially when they misread that theory to mean that a social category has the magical power to bring what it names into being. That was a false view, and it is the one that they now own for themselves as they seek to produce a social consensus that gender ideology not only exists, which it does not, but that it is a dangerous force, which it is not, threatening every aspect of life that people hold dear, man, woman, family, the nation itself. Well, it's difficult to explain this attack on gender. How do we explain the fact that gender now stands for queer and trans theory and policy, feminist scholarship, reproductive rights, progressive law, and civil rights? In the US, authoritarianism can only keep power if the people let it do so. So why is it that people would be willing to support anti-gender policies? What fears are they having? Why are so many people afraid of gender? How did it become gender such a dangerous idea? Well, I would suggest to you that we are all, in some sense, afraid of gender. If we think of gender as a set of norms that communicate expectations about how we should emerge into the world, what bodily form we should take or assume, how we are to comport ourselves, then there is good reason to worry that we might fail at the task required. Who sets the rules for becoming a gender, and what freedom is there to change them? Gender, conceived as a normative organization of social reality, is also communicated as a set of demands or expectations with the understanding that certain very painful consequences may follow if one fails to conform: imprisonment, pathologization, the deprivation of shelter, excommunication from the family, or a religious community, living without health care. So some might fear gender as one would fear any set of norms and possible punishments, but there is also something intimate about gender. It's a way bodies are organized, but it's also a way that they conduct themselves in relation to one another. It is this body, after all, material and singular, that is at once socially formed and acting with, against, and beyond those received norms. Yet others, doubtless mindful of this intimate terrain, long for a set of stable structures, ones that do not change in time. They want, perhaps, an identity fixed by either natural or symbolic law or by the state itself. They fear the variability of gender, not only the different ways that men and women now act, but the apparent fact that the categories change meaning in time, that those assigned female at birth can become men, that those assigned male at birth can become women, that intersexed people are demanding recognition for their embodied lives, and that some people live outside the binary categories of man and woman, either in new categories as non-binary or in the interstices among existing categories. Those who are unsettled by the variability of gender, its different configurations, are especially vulnerable to those politicians who insist that gender is an ideology and, together with other forms of wokeism, are responsible for the destruction of the family, civilization, man, and national cultures. I would suggest that the anti-gender political discourse heightens the ordinary anxiety that people have about gender, associating and conflating that regular anxiety with a generalized fear about the future of the world itself. Its climate, the increasing precarity of work, the intensification of wealth among the very few, the open-ended character of brutal wars, the challenges to the homogeneity of national and local cultures posed by migration and forcible displacement. There are, of course, many reasons to fear. Trump is one of them. But gender is not the cause of any of those conditions that have given rise to a generalized concern about the future of the world. To those who think that gender or gender studies is a form of indoctrination, the response should be firm. Gender is neither an ideology nor a form of indoctrination. Indeed, the critique of gender within gender studies is usually productive. If anything, gender is a framework that allows us to ask, among other questions, how is the social world organized? Through what exclusions and with what potentials? The debates on such questions are open-ended for those who have learned from the field that openness is a promising value to be affirmed. For others, social structure should remain unchanging and based on pre-social differences that can be known apart from any interpretive framework or social meanings. The irony is that those who seek to censor books on gender or to close down the teaching of gender studies are themselves imposing a doctrine on research and teaching. They are saying, you may not think that way. They are saying, we are closing your mind. We have the right to close your mind. In addition, shutting down open debate in public life and open inquiry in the academy does not bode well for democracy and its claims of free expression and open debate. And yet, this is precisely what the anti-gender ideology movement calls for. It is a campaign of falsification and censorship that strengthens repressive state powers. We need to understand how the intensified opposition to gender fits within the emerging of authoritarian regimes that now gain support through the fantasy of restoring patriarchal and heteronormative orders. As I mentioned earlier, gender does not only characterize identities, it's a framework for understanding a major form of power in society, the way it established separate spheres and social inequalities and exclusions. It includes the analysis of gender-based violence or gender differences in healthcare research or rethinking equality, justice, and freedom. Gendered frameworks have proven to be productive in ecological politics, consider ecofeminism, but also anti-violence policies. Gender policy, gender politics, as it relates to feminism, to gay, lesbian, trans, non-binary, intersex lives, all of these are lives that are seeking greater freedoms, greater equality, less pathologization, and they are contesting discourses and policies that have kept them, though all the people named by those categories, from flourishing. So I would suggest to you that right-wing nationalist movements that incite hatred against migrants and trans people alike are calling for a return to or a protection of national cultures that very often depend on white supremacy, the heteronormative family, and in the case of Orban, it is explicitly miscegenation, which threatens the purity of the nation. Authoritarian regimes have increasingly concocted a gender scare as a way of deflecting from the historical conditions of economic, ecological, and social instability and destruction. The ravages of increasingly deregulated capitalism remain deflected by such arguments. They are protected from critical examination, and socialist alternatives are either reduced to their neoliberal variant or quickly associated with the worst histories of state Marxism. The arguments against gender are very similar to those used to oppose the study of post-colonial theory in Germany or critical race theory in the UK. All of this happens without serious consideration of any actual texts in the field or what the field seeks to do within the context of the university. Again, a reductive caricature substitutes for a nuanced field of study that constitutes but one set of perspectives within the indispensable fields of race and colonial studies. When authoritarians promise a return to an impossible time, the restoration of order, the defense of the nation, they stoke a furious nostalgia among those who have no better way to understand what is it that is undermining their sense of a durable and livable life. We find this in the discourse of the AfD in Germany, the Fratelli d'Italia, Bolsonaro's followers in Brazil, Trump, Orban, and Putin, Erdogan, the Christian nationalism of Korea and Taiwan. But we also see the anti-gender animus among centrists who recruit support from the right wing in order to stay in power. I would suggest to you that we are, of course, right to defend gender, to try to show that they have a mistaken understanding, to correct the falsehoods that are being circulated. That's very important, and those of us in academic life have a public responsibility to explain what gender is and is not, and the various views of gender, since there is no one idea of gender. But for any alternative to authoritarianism to emerge, it has to address the fears about the future that many people live with. And we need to make clear that gender is not something to be feared, and it is not the source of instability or fearful ideation in our world. It should not be. We have to offer an alternative vision. It would be collectively wrought. It would have to oppose rights stripping, eliminationist politics, and dispossession. It would have to stand in alliance with migrants, with trans people, with all sorts of people who are having their rights stripped away, who are candidates for elimination, the people of Gaza for sure, the dispossession of native peoples from their land. And it would be important to stand against all forms of violence, especially legal and state violence, and to affirm the radical equality value and interdependency of life. I've suggested today that queer theory is less concerned with identity than with alliance, departing or deviating from constraining norms to build a different kind of future. But to build that future, we will need a radically new imagination. And the imagination we require will not be populated by toxic phantasms, brutal caricatures that reduce and degrade vulnerable communities. No, it will be a counter-imaginary for our times that would oppose the eliminationist dimension of fascist passions. Um, uh, uh, and it would regard lives, all lives, as grievable, that is to say, as worthy of living and worthy of support and infrastructure for life. I would also remind us, though I can't talk about it now, that fascism is with us now. And it shows us the relationship between systemic inequality and eliminationism. It rests on the principle that some lives should be abandoned or eliminated and others extolled as most worthy. But we must insist, in my view, that all life is equally valuable. And the all of all life implies universalizability. The equal of equally valuable implies radical equality. To live a life means to live a life in freedom, one that is shared with others and that constitutes one essential feature of our shared lives. And finally, let's remember that as humans, we are human animals. We are related to animals, we are animals, and we belong to the earth. And this reminds us of interrelational forms that life invariably takes. It's one reason why identity as a category might separate us from others and from our relationships. But interdependency and interrelationality is characteristic of life itself. It's an ecological notion. It's also a queer one. For I am not just this identity, because who I am is nothing without the relationships which make my life possible and which give my life its sense. For me, interdependence and interrelationality are also queer values. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Butler, for that really amazing lecture. And we're really grateful for your insights. So we've actually prepared a few questions to begin our Q&A session, and some of which you already talked about briefly, so please feel free to address them selectively. and then we will open up the floor to questions from our audience. So just to start, our first question is, have you observed any new conditions in the field of gender study with social movements potential? And could you help the audience list out a few major theoretical updates to your initial position since gender trouble based on these new conditions and dialogues with other scholars? And also, could you discuss any unexpected reflections, interpretations, or application of your work?
Well, first of all, let's remember that Gender Trouble was published more than 35 years ago. And of course, I wrote it, 38 years ago. It took a while back then to finish the book and have it be reviewed and published and all that. So I would say I wrote it in 1987, 88, which is a very long time ago. And there were some problems with that book. My sentences were long and complex. My references were European, mainly French, although some of the politics was US, but it belonged to a Euro-Atlantic Anglosphere. And I think that I was not taking into account different ways of thinking about gender in different languages. And I was not yet thinking that I had an audience to whom I had to speak in relatively clear ways. I think it has been helpful to me to read feminist work in the biological sciences. I've read a fair amount now in genetics and hormones, and I understand better how to understand the criticism that gender denies biological reality or gender denies material bodies. I think gender doesn't have to do that. And I've learned a lot both from materialists and from feminist and queer work in the biological sciences. I would also say that although I did insist that that queer was a term of alliance rather than identity fairly early in my career, I didn't understand the importance of transnational alliances, which I now very deeply affirm. I think the success of Ni Una Menos and other feminist queer movements has shown me how important the arts are, but also transnational alliances and multilingualism and the practice of translation, all of which I try to think about in my most recent work, Who's Afraid of Gender? I think that if queer is really truly going to be a term of alliance, we need to ally with migrants, with racial injustice, with ecological politics that seek to reverse the devastation that has happened to the earth. And I think we also need to be part of anti-capitalist campaigns and anti-carceral campaigns. So, there's a phrase, queers are everywhere. They must be everywhere because we're not just a community that cuts itself off from other progressive and emancipatory movements. We need to be in them all and of them all, and also learning from them and revising our views. Anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Professor Butler. That was a very insightful answer. And our second question is that as such a founding figure of queer theory, to what degree are you informed or interested in queer theory development in East Asia or China region? And what advice would you offer to young scholars, especially East Asian scholars aspiring to contribute to this field? And also, what do you look forward to seeing in terms of the evolution of queer theory?
Yes. Well, I have to say that in the last 15 years, I've probably had 10 dissertation students who work on queer Asian studies. And some of it is more Asian American, some of it is East Asian, some of it is distinctively from China or from Hong Kong. But I have a wide number of graduate students at the University of California, Berkeley, who work in that area and who've certainly taught me about that. So I am interested. I visited Beijing and Shanghai. I met with queer activists and artists in Shanghai, and I learned a great deal from them about negotiating censorship and also about how to keep solidarity and networks open and active under conditions of censorship. I've also learned a great deal about Christian nationalism and how the missionary movements have affected politics in South Korea and in Taiwan. I've also visited Japan and saw uh, how difficult it is to fight patriarchy and homophobia even in the liberal progressive domains. So I've been very lucky to establish some important contacts and to learn about the kinds of movements and scholarship that's happening in several parts of East Asia. Oh, and Southeast Asia, I should say. I have a wonderful student who works in Vietnam.
Thank you, Professor Butler. We really appreciate this perspective. And our third question is that considering the majority's relative comfort with their assigned sex, how can we really elevate queer issues to become a priority in the mainstream discourse?
Well, I think, first of all, it's interesting to talk to people about their comfort with their assigned sex because, of course, many people are quite comfortable with the sex that they've been assigned. Um, but if we take seriously the idea that sex is assigned and then you emerge into the world either with a sense like, that's a good assignment, I like this assignment, I'm staying with this assignment works for me. I can express myself. I move in the world. I feel recognized by the assignment. It's all good. Even for people who feel that way, they should be able to hear that for others, being assigned a sex and then trying to live out life within those terms is not possible. It's enormous suffering, and it actually does damage to the person who's trying to fit that category. So I think we need to accept the idea that there are at least two dimensions to sex assignment. There's the moment you're assigned, and then there's the fact that we are assigned all the time. We are interpolated. We move into social, institutional, legal settings where people tell us what our sex is, or they address us as if we are a certain sex or as if we are embodying a certain idea of sex. So there's always been that discrepancy between the original moment of assignment and then how that category is lived, whether it's lived well, happily, whether it's lived unwell, whether it has to be shifted, changed, redefined in order for life to be livable, whether it has to be moved out of the way and refused in the name of another category for life to become possible. It just seems that we need to give cisgendered people a way to understand their happiness, right? It's like, for you, that's how you lived it. Other people find it unlivable, or other people had to change it. It seems to me we have to accept, though, that there's always that question: how is it that you live your sex assignment? The answer might be fine. But the fact is, there is this difference between the assignment and the question, how will it be lived? And once we get people to understand that divergence, that dual dimension of sex assignment, it seems to me that they'll be better equipped to affirm the decisions that some people have to make in relation to original sex assignment in order to live well.
Thank you. That was really thought-provoking. So our next prepared question is about DEI, and that's actually a nice segue into our audience question because I saw in the chat that several people have also raised this question. So I will just choose from one of the most representative ones, and I will read it out for the sake of time. And this is from Stephanie Wong. I have a question. I'm reading that I have a question as someone who's teaching gender studies in a liberal arts college in upstate New York. And how do we do the challenging work of fighting our academic freedom while at the same time complicating the neoliberal multicultural DEI work? As the current administration catalyzes anti-normative discourse, especially on gender and sexuality, into DEI initiatives.
Well, I think we have to do two things at once, maybe three. One is continue doing the best teaching we can do. In other words, within the classroom, we need to have the text, the film, the whatever object it is we are studying. We need that common material. We need to teach people how to read and read carefully and to think critically and to think with imagination, and to find their own point of view and give it the best possible representation. We have an obligation as teachers to provide the best education possible. So I would keep the classroom focused and continue to do the good work that there is to be done in gender, sexuality, women's studies, etc. At the same time, everyone has to ask, what are the conditions under which I am teaching? What are the conditions under which I am speaking extramurally outside the walls of the classroom? What are the conditions under which I'm paid, or that secure my appointment, if anything does? Most teachers no longer have tenure, as you know, and that institution is under assault. Um, and there's a question of a political effort to defend the integrity and the importance of gender studies as a field. So even as we are doing the research and teaching inside the field, we have to step out and speak publicly and to administrators, sometimes to state legislatures, if it's a public university in the US, to donors, to everyone who's making those financial decisions of why this is enormously valuable. Now, the problem emerges, as your question implies, what's the scheme of values that administrators are using? And if it's thoroughly neoliberal, like, how do we even speak to that? It seems to me that we can't translate ourselves into the neoliberal language in order to show our value, because we will always be devalued according to that particular metric. So we need to insist that another set of values be um, uh, brought to the front, including open inquiry, which defines universities, academic freedom, which defines faculty autonomy over what they teach, and also ideals of democratic open debate that are informed. Because one of the things we are obviously seeing, especially, well, not just in the US, but in Argentina, in Brazil, in Germany, people coming to political decisions or decisions about who's to have rights and who's not, based on caricatures, prejudices, uninformed ideas. So it's extremely important that gender studies be understood um, as a field, as a discipline that is in favor of open inquiry, that's not about indoctrination, but is actually holding open the idea of open inquiry as the better way of arriving at truth, of informed decisions and informed judgments. I know that probably sounds somewhat liberal, but it's better than neoliberal and maybe more effective in these situations. But we should also be defending unionization efforts and opposing deportation and censorship efforts at colleges and universities, because right now we're being targeted, and it's going to be important both to save our own units, our own disciplines, but also to keep the police and the state from intervening in the important work that we do.
Thank you so much for your insights on such an important topic. So our next question from the audience is from Ivy Huang. So although transnational queer activism has challenged gender norms globally, some argue that queer theory has been co-opted by colonial structures to reinforce Western ideological dominance. In China, for example, the government has used this argument to justify the marginalization of queer individuals, often framing LGBTQ plus rights as a Western imposition. So, how can queer individuals and communities navigate these intersecting systems of power, such as cis patriarchy, heteropatriarchy, colonialism, and white supremacy?
Yes. Well, look, there are versions of queer culture that are very media driven and market driven, and we can't control all of that. There's a lot of stuff on television and film that makes queer life into a consumer item or a fascinating spectacle, and that's not that's not uh, in my mind um, the best representation of what queer studies or queer movements can do, but it is a commercialization for sure. But let me say this. Um, if you look at the decolonial work on gender, um, and one of the things you will see is that Christian missionaries that have been part of the history of imperialism have imposed ideas of the family and of gender norms on communities in Latin America, in Africa, in India, in Sri Lanka, in um, uh, in a number of East Asian countries where Christian nationalism is also very, very high. Um, so the Christian missionary position is one that has not only enforced the heteronormative family, but also binary gender and women's subordination and the pathologization of gay and lesbian lives and trans lives. So, and the rest of us, the non-binaries among us. And the erasure of intersex people. So it seems to me that queer theory has to be anti-colonial. It actually has to have an anti-colonial commitment, and it has to work in tandem with anti-colonial struggles. The imperialism that has most profoundly affected gender has been the imperialism of Christian nationalism and the imposition of those norms on local cultures that very often have different vernaculars and vocabularies for understanding gender, kinship, family, and the rest. So that's where the critique of imperialism should be. Of course, we all know the US uses feminism to conduct its wars. There's pinkwashing in Israel. We know how state powers can use queer, trans, feminist work to fortify their patriarchal and militarist ventures, as if they're saving us all. And even Trump's order, right? He's going to attack gender ideology in order to save women. It's like that is a contradiction in terms. Women are a gender. The women is the most important gendered category in the history of gender. There's just no question. But what he's really doing is making sure trans people don't have rights. And he's also saying that cis or women assigned female at birth are to be protected against trans women who are, as you know, very often figured as nefarious men with designs on women. So I think we need to be really careful when patriarchal imperialists invoke anti-imperialism, or when the church invokes anti-imperialism, when it is itself an imperial power. and has done more than anything else to restrict and regulate gender relations in the history of the world.
Thank you so much for your insights. So we actually have several different questions related to this. So I will just lump them together and see if you have anything to add. First of all, this is a question from Chiu Meng Sun. So this question is about how can the shared trauma among queer and women and queer communities become a foundation for coalition building and initiate concrete policy change? And another question from Lemony is that what guidance would you offer to those working on the ground, particularly in making queer theories accessible and actionable outside of academia?
Well, first of all, I don't know if trauma is the basis for solidarity. I guess I would say undergoing trauma and finding solidarity with others who have undergone similar kinds of experiences is extremely important. But what's most important is allowing traumatic material to be transformed, right? To the point where it's not just that I or a singular person can survive a trauma, but where we can produce new conditions of reality where no one has to go through that trauma again, right? So having a cultivating a collective desire for a world in which that kind of trauma does not have to be experienced again is the moment in which it becomes political. But we have to perhaps move beyond trauma to repair and understand repair as collective and as also militant, right? A militant response to trauma, not the one that denies it, but also one that takes that material and seeks to transform it. Of course, then it becomes pain and suffering, perhaps, that can be transformed rather than trauma that is paralyzing and that keeps us stuck in the past. So trauma has to give way to pain and suffering, we might say, in order to become available for a reworking and a collective demand to produce a world in which no one has to experience that again. For people on the ground, I think we're all on the ground these days. Some of us are moved between the university and the ground. I think we all have to take the time to explain fundamental things, not in a patronizing way, but in a way that people will understand. And that happens differently in different languages. It's also very hard when you're explaining to family or communities that find words like gender or queer very alien and academic and Western and or elitist, maybe breaking it down, translating it into other languages. There's no reason why we have to keep the word gender. We don't. In certain parts of the world, it doesn't work. It's not translatable. So you come up with another way of trying to explain the idea or the aspiration. So I don't think we have to be wedded to the English term gender. I think that is a mistake. We need to accept non-translatability when it emerges and allow gender to fade away in light of new language that reaches people more effectively.
Thank you very much. That really gives us a lot to think about. So our next question from the audience is about the possibility of resistance. So this is a question from Xin Yuan. Is that how can individuals cultivate an impactful gender political violence when direct political action is constrained? And are alternative public spaces viable means of resistance? And also, how does the thinking of temporality opens up possibility of resistance and coalition building in queer activism?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I see some of you, I don't know where everybody is in this meeting today, but when I could see the larger panorama, I saw that some of you have animals as your avatar. Some of you just have a name. It may be your name. It may not be your name. Might be a name you use for Zoom. Because I don't know where you are in the world or what kind of censorship you might be facing by being on this Zoom meeting. And I've certainly had Zooms with groups in Russia, for instance, where no one could show their face. I mean, Zoom itself is a problem. Do we know what kind of surveillance there is in Zoom? We know there is some. We use it anyway because we need to stay connected. There are ways of eluding the censor on the internet, even though the internet is, as we know, owned increasingly by a few group of people. We can't really connect on the Elon Musk uh, platforms anymore without immediately being uh, um, a candidate for surveillance. But there are other platforms and people are developing new ones. So moving between platforms, establishing networks online and in person. I think the public gathering or the private gathering of people is extremely important right now, that we can't just be isolated with our screens. We also need to actually meet up. And how you do that, under what conditions, is of course complicated when public assembly is not possible. So where do you go? What are the spaces that are possible? You know those spaces, and people can make them periodically, and they can shift from space to space in order to escape capture or surveillance. It's risky. It's very risky. We also know that shifting your VPN is a queer practice, right? You just go, you travel someplace, you get a different VPN, you come back, you shift your avatar. I saw how this works. I know how this works. But people do find ways of continuing to network, to meet, and to produce their solidarities. And it's so important because the news is very bad, and we all stand a chance of becoming extremely depressed and dispirited and hopeless. But coming together, and I hope this meeting is one such meeting, can be a way of experiencing uplift and regeneration, some new hope, some new plans. We need to share strategies. We need places where we can share strategies. We need to be able to analyze what strategies worked and what did not. But we also need a vision. We need artists and others coming in to give us a new way of imagining the world, because we can't just be fighting against existing powers. We also have to be able to show people the world we want to live in and invite them to live in that world with us. And we have to remember not just to take apart existing power or to critique the falsehoods and caricatures that are so deeply damaging, or to repeal those laws. All that is really important. Radical lawyers have never been more important. At the same time, who's going to give us the vision of the world that we want to live in, and what would be the principles? How would they be embodied? What do we know about the world we want to live in? What do we want to say to people when we say no, you don't take the authoritarian offer, you don't take the fascist appeal, you say no to that in favor of, look, this other world, the one we are drawing, painting, filming for you. So I think multimedia strategies, but also transnational alliances, reflecting on strategies that work and don't, but keeping in mind we always have to have that vision that we believe and we can show is more compelling than what's happening on the authoritarian right.
Thank you. That was very powerful, and I'm sure it resonates with a lot of us. So we have two questions that are related and seems like a follow-up, so I will just ask them two in a row. So this question is from Suri. It's about, you mentioned the new technology, and this is about AI. So how might AI shape our understanding of gender roles and identities and maybe the future of queer theory? And also the other question is about also pathways of resistance or migration. Also, something that you mentioned is that many queer individuals in China once viewed migration as a means of achieving a more livable life. But with the global rise of the right-wing politics, including Trump's election, so migration feel less like a guarantee of safety. So how might queer theory help us rethink political agency and survival when the traditional framework of escaping is not less viable?
Yes, that's a huge question. It's a very good question, and I think we're all trying to think about that. And I'm wondering, like, do I need to migrate? If so, where would I go? I think right now, many people are staying where they are in order to fight where they are, to see what changes can happen, and also to be support for communities of people who are trying to make change, right? So we have to be regenerated as persons at the same time that we fight for changes in the world. So what can we do? Where can we do something best? And also, where will we be safe? I don't know. The shifting terms of safety, it's very hard to say. Um, uh, I know that from the US, people look north at Canada and think maybe they would be better off there or possibly in Mexico City. And I also think there are parts of Europe that are actually probably more safe than the United States right now, but that might change. You know, you arrive someplace and then suddenly it's changed. It's very hard. It's why the struggle against authoritarianism and the fascist underpinnings of it has to be global in nature. Um, I don't have a good answer for you. AI, right now, I'm trying to live to the side of AI. I know that's impossible. Um, I have a very negative view of it, but I know that there are people who think, oh, it can be used for the purposes of resistance. And my guess is that they're younger than me and they know things that I don't know. So it's a topic that I'm not very good at answering or at addressing. And my apologies about that.
Thank you very much for sharing your perspective. So our next question is more specifically about one of your work. So this is by Tina. So in Violence Mourning Politics, you discuss how certain identities and groups are derealized and dehumanized, rendering them subsumed under power and control. And you also propose mourning as a potential practice for reconfiguring our ties to lost identities. So, in the context of globalization, where hybridity and homogenization become increasingly entangled, how do you see the role of queer feminist activism in navigating these complexities and recovering lost cultural connections? And what are some potential acts that we can take to bridge queer theory and cultural studies?
Many questions, all good, all excellent questions. Um, so let me say a few things first about mourning. Well, as you know, there have always been feminist activist groups like Women in Black or the Madres or the Abuelas in Argentina. And they have taken on a kind of traditional role of women as grieving, but what they've done is to deprivatize grief, right? They've brought grief into the public, and they've used the occasion of grieving to indict the state for its violence, whether it's the disappeared, um, uh, for whom the state is responsible, or it's the wars that have killed so many people in the Balkans and elsewhere. Um, uh, Women in Black, for instance, uh, have documented war damage and devastation, or in some of the activist groups in Japan that I met, feminist queer, who were um, not only grieving the losses from the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also developing an anti-militarist, anti-violence position that was feminist and queer. So I see that there are these really important groups that are doing this work. But let's remember that grief, public grief, is a way of saying this was a life or these were lives that should not have been taken, that were unfairly and unjustly taken from the world, from the realm of the living. And in standing for them and remembering them and memorializing them, we are also saying that we want a world in which that does not happen. We want a world that's dedicated to infrastructures that allow people to continue to live and live well. They're dedicated to health and education, to um, to ecology, right? That are life affirming in all of those ways. Um, so very often, public grieving can be a way of making a demand and envisioning a different world. It's not just focusing on the past and who was lost and lamenting, although it is that, but it's also about moving forward. Now, I would also say that public grieving can be a way of making solidarity between the living and the dead. Like they are still with us, and we are still not only acting with them and for them, but they inspire our action and they are embodied in our action. So, in some sense, that's the best way of mourning, which is a ritualized way of keeping the dead alive or keeping the dead present as we move forward to build a different kind of world. I don't know much about uh, cultural studies and feminism and all that. I think there are patriarchal versions of cultural studies I've never really liked. And we have to be really careful of that. Feminism should be at the forefront of that field, and if it's not, something's wrong. Um, but let me just say this: I think we've underestimated the importance of getting angry and even of a certain kind of cultivated rage. Um, um, so to go back to the practice of public mourning, um, it can also be a way of gathering, protesting, and expressing rage together collectively um, in honor of life, not in a destructive way, but in a way that allows rage to become a form of life affirmation. Um, and I think that's complicated, but if we're furious that people have been destroyed and killed unjustly, then our fury, our rage should also be cultivated into construction so that we don't enter into the cycle of destruction. Um, that's not always easy to do. It's an artful way of life to make your rage productive and life affirming, but it can be done.
Wow, thank you. That gives us a lot to think about, definitely. Um, and our next question from the audience is also related to a very recurring theme of your writing, which is about desire. So this question from Zijing Ye is, how can we escape or reset the structure of desire shaped by the post-media pharmacopornographic age?
Well, I think that that's a really big question, and I think a lot of young people who have been subject to living on the media, right, who live inside the internet and who for whom pornography is a primary way of understanding sexuality, who very often find themselves confused by what they've learned and seen and don't know how to translate it out into their lives or how to change that so that they can have a different relationship to sexuality. Um, I I don't think we can change our desires through self-reflection and analysis, except um, uh, to the degree that we can see that something else got a hold of us. A pornography that is violent or that is debasing to women or uh, 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 degrades sexuality itself. What other cultural resources are there? What other kinds of films, what other kinds of photos, what other kinds of stories can we draw from? So I think we need to make ourselves available to different cultural resources that can combat the ones that have been seeking to structure our desire. I don't think any of us are completely determined by cultural material. There's always a disturbance there. Like, oh, this seems to be what I want because that's what I saw. But there's also a question, why do I want this? And this doesn't seem very desirable. What can I do? The disturbance is productive. And it's at that point where you need to go find other kinds of materials, other conversations, other films, other stories that allow us to imagine and to feel in new ways. Um, but I'm but I think that's a difficult kind of transformation. Most of us only transform sexuality in the context of relationships that are committed to reciprocity and trust uh, and equality, and then it seems we find new ways.
Thank you very much for your perspective. And so our next question is about the politics in the United States. So this question from Feng Yiwang is that given the limitations of the two-party system, should left-leaning voters compromise and support centrist Democrats for the sake of women and trans rights?
Well, look, the fact is things would have been better had Kamala Harris been elected, right? Um, she was not ideal in any way. She had great limits. Many of us disagreed with her on her foreign policy, especially on Israel-Palestine, and on migration, quite frankly. Um, but look, even her hardline on migration, which the left disagreed with, wasn't strong enough to attract the right. So I think we have to give up on the idea that only a centrist Democrat will allow us to form a party um, large enough, popular enough to defeat the right. I think we need to move to the left of that party and see whether we can appeal more broadly to workers and to all those who are disenfranchised and all those who are committed to equality and, well, frankly, constitutional democracy at this point. But it's going to be, given the devastations of Trump, it will be a different political landscape when next we have a chance to choose. And I certainly do hope that the Democratic Party opens to all those on the left that it excluded, and that it gives up its fanciful ideas that only the center can win.
Thank you very much for sharing your take on this question. So the next question from the audience is by Xu Tingdai. So my personal question is what to make of the fact that in a society where civil action is suppressed, such as China, marginalized groups utilize feminism and queer theory to integrate each other. This may be a departure from the original intent of anti-identity politics, but there is also a motivation behind it to rebel against the whole political schema of strong government and weak civil society.
So if I understand correctly, you're saying forms of solidarity can be established outside of both civil society and the state party apparatus on the basis of identity, and that in this way it is most powerful. And if that's what you're saying, then the only thing I would point out is that these are identities that are coming together, which means they're in relationship with one another, and that that it only works to the degree that the alliance itself is a value. And I suppose my point is to say that the value of alliance is a queer value. You can say, and I accept that people now say I am queer, and I say it, and it's happened. It was not something that could happen in the 90s, actually, which may surprise you. But it's okay. But even when we say I am something, we make the identity claim, we're saying it to someone. We're addressing someone with our proclamation about who we are. So we're asking someone to hear what we're saying. We're trying to speak in a way that can be received. And there is this scene of address. There's a interlocution going on, right? So we are already in a social relationship at the moment in which we claim identity. So I want us to remember that. It's like, how do we claim it? For what purpose? To whom and why? So that takes care of my concern that by being identitarian, we might become so particularistic that we separate ourselves off from others. But if what you're telling me is that this is a way to connect, then all good, all good.
Thank you very much, Professor Butler. I noticed that we're nearing the end of our time together, actually. So on behalf of everyone here, I just want to say really thank you, Professor Butler, for engaging with all these questions. And this has been a really incredibly enriching session, and we appreciate everyone's participation, and we hope that you all enjoyed this event. We encourage also everyone to maybe continue exploring Professor Butler's work, and thank you for joining us. Professor Butler, thank you again for your really precious time and insight. And this actually concludes our formal event. So feel free to log off whenever you wish.
Great. Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure and honor for me.
Thank you, Professor Butler.
Thank you. Yeah, I see everybody's thanking. I thank you. Thank you so much.
Do you have any closing statement to address to the audience just before you go?
No, it's sad that I can't meet you and, take your hand or see your face, but perhaps our paths will cross at some point. Thank you so much for giving me your time, and I wish you well, courage and joy, both of them, courage and joy. Okay. Ciao. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the important message.